This is the Final Thought Exchange podcast where you get a little wiser by learning from the leading thinkers in finance. I'm your host, Lotta Moberg, and our guest today is Joseph Simonian. He is a globally renowned investor and researcher in quantitative finance, machine learning, factor investing, and portfolio construction. Simonian has held senior portfolio management and research positions in several prominent asset management firms, so he's well known in the industry for many of you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Lotta. Very happy to be here.
So we really wanted to talk to you and really congratulate you to this piece that you've written for us. It's called Investment Model Validation, a guide for practitioners. So it's about model validation in finance. It's quite technical, but it's also philosophical in many ways. So I thought maybe you could start off by just giving an overview and tell our audience about the field of model validation. How should we think of it? Is it a technical field? Is it a very kind of subjective, anything goes, or are there boxes of textbooks that everybody should follow, or how kind of what is your view on the field as a whole?
Well, there's been a lot of research over the years on different aspects of model validation, but the monograph is really built on two conceptual pillars. The first is that building financial products is really no different from building any other kind of a product or producing any other kind of product. For example, pharmaceuticals, right? And in order to produce a product that is commercially viable and that addresses the needs of your end users, clients, you have to really take a lot of pains to make sure that the end product is a high quality, thoroughly tested, validated, robust product that you are delivering to your end user. Now, in finance, that's a little bit more complicated because even though we have regulators, we do not have an FDA-like arbiter of doing more harm than good, for example, as a standard. And given this fact, we have to take it upon ourselves as investment professionals to institute model validation procedures and processes and protocols that are actually effective in terms of, first of all, weeding out the detrimental or potentially harmful products that will not help our clients make money, or obviously in the extreme will facilitate them losing money on the one hand, and on the other, we have to make sure that we ourselves are comfortable with that process and that it's repeatable. Now, the repetition so the repetitive aspect of model validation also speaks to the second conceptual pillar of the monograph, which is to try and take a scientific approach to model validation. Now, to many quants, that may seem as it's no surprise, or I'm not really making any kind of revelation. But if you think about it, even though finance has had science envy for a long time, many decades, the practices that we often enact in developing investment strategies, investment products, so on and so forth, are often decidedly unscientific. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that a scientist will typically try to falsify their theories in order to test their robustness. In other words, if a scientist has a theory about something, some aspect of nature, they will use empirical data, experiments, conceptual analysis, logical analysis, so on and so forth, in order to sort of quote unquote break that model. If they can't break the model, then there is a decent chance that theory will have some explanatory power and will assist them in making predictions in a laboratory setting or outside of it. Now, a big part of that, again, is the sort of throwing that theory against the wall, trying to break it. In finance, though, we often see the opposite. We often see research teams and PM teams testing many, many strategies, seeing a lot of failures, and then hitting upon one that works in a very simple back test and screaming eureka when they discover something that works. And then they try to develop that and commercialize it and productize it and so on. And lo and behold, when they get out to the real world and there is the markets where there is essentially a new set of data that strategy is encountering, the product fails. And so that is a decidedly unscientific way of going about product development, because instead of trying to actually break it in the product development, model development process, what's happening is often is that folks are trying to just select the first one or two or three or whatever that work and going forward with that. And that is decidedly unscientific. That is the root to what they call in statistics false positive strategies. And we see them all over the place on Wall Street, unfortunately.
Well, aren't we relying to a large extent then on a kind of an evolutionary process where we're trying out different things? And if you have a firm, you have a bad model, well, the AUM goes out the window, and so we get the right results as that result. Or are you thinking that there is a need for some kind of more top-down control over is applied out there?
Well, it's not about control necessarily. What it's about is that, it's about taking a little bit more time in the product development process. And I realize that firms have deadlines and they have to roll out products in order to compete with their competitors and so on. It's a business at the end of the day. But rather than quickly trying to discovering something that passes some initial smell test and then putting the onus on marketing, right, and sales to sell something that maybe 5, 10 years down the road will implode, it may behoove firms to actually spend more time on the validation process, make sure they actually have, the requisite confidence in a product, and then commercialize it, because it'll actually help them and their clients down the road because they know that they have a much more robust product to offer, right? And so, in that sense, like, yeah, I just go back to it. It's no different from developing a drug or even building a table or any kind of product. You don't want it to fall down or the legs to break 2 weeks after you take it home. You want it to be robust and last forever. So I think that's really what I'm advocating in the monograph. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that there's no model validation going on on the street. What I'm saying is that it's often inadequate, and we see that with the collapse of many popular strategies as of late and over the last few years. And again, I think to a large extent that is because let's say the empirical analysis, for instance, not that what has been done has not been thorough, but they haven't gone, a layer or two beneath what they have gone in order to actually verify the robustness in full of the products that they put out. So that's essentially the message there.
Yeah. Well, my background is in economics, and that's a social science just as finance is, in my view. And I would think that model validation, model creation, testing, and all of that would be very similar to other social sciences, the political science, as well as economics and other.
Well, I mean, finance has become very quantitative. So, not that all the political science and the other social sciences haven't. Quantitative methods are actually used quite a bit in those social sciences as well. So, if you look at political science, for example, the game theory revolution, really hit all political science a long time ago. So, formal methods have been utilized all across the board. But I would say finance is particularly quantitative, and it has become more so, even though, to your point, because it is a social science in essence, the drivers of economic and market behavior are human psychology, human intentionality, and that's often overlooked by the science fetishism that we have on the street and quantitative finance, because we actually like and tend to think of um, uh, market actors and market behavior as being mechanistic, as we often find in nature. Just think about the quantitative finance and infatuation with concepts like Brownian motion and so on and so forth. These are all borrowed from natural science and the physical sciences in particular, which has not always been a useful analogy. So now, how that plays into model validation, I think, is in various ways. I think one of the chapters in the monograph speaks about testing your models against economic theory. And one of the branches of economics that I cite is behavioral finance. Right? And I think when you're testing a model, often models that are trying to generate alpha, let's say, are trying to capitalize on some sort of behavioral anomalies. And when you are validating a model, then therefore it's useful to ask yourself, okay, what sort of behavioral, let's say, biases or heuristics or what have you is the model trying to address? Number one. Number two, is it doing it on a systematic and reliable basis? And three, is it accounting for, or is it actually being driven by other drivers, behavioral or otherwise, that it's not supposed to be driven by, right? So human behavior and sort of behavioral science can actually bring itself or sort of inject itself into the model validation and model development process as well. And I think it really has to. I mean, I'm a big a fan, if you will, or advocate of behavioral finance. I think it's very critical and important to understanding how markets work, especially if you're an active manager. And so I think that's how the social science aspect of finance comes into play.
So is that a good overview, maybe of model testing? I mean, if people hear model testing, they might think of back testing, like you have data from the past, something worked on that data, and now you use it on a sample that is different from the data that you built your model upon. But there's so much more to that. Is there like a concise way to describe like what encapsulates what it consists of, like model testing?
Well, backtesting is certainly part of it. That's your chapter one, right? So,
Exactly. But it's not only that, right? That's like, I think that's what a lot of people think about is only that, if you just think like model, because that's like maybe top of mind and what people are most familiar with.
right. So the way I approach the process, and again, it's a framework, so it's not a set in stone. Don't change any piece of this puzzle type of a framework. It's telling you that there are basic elements that you should touch on or address during the model validation process, and if you don't, there may be something amiss with your process. So backtesting is typically where everybody begins. There's nothing wrong with that because you want to find out if history provides any regularities that you can capitalize upon, and then you want to discover what the sources of those irregularities or anomalies are that you can actually exploit, right? um, and but then you proceed to what I call a cousin of back testing, which is cross validation, which is where you separate a larger sample into three segments really. The first segment is used to really train your model, to really build it, and then the second is to validate it, to sort of fine tune it, and then finally you reserve a unseen quote unquote subset to test the model. And again, this is again a species of a back test, but it's a much more regimented approach to it. And I go into different ways of doing time series cross validation and how to actually use econometrics to inform that process, right? So there's a little bit of a mixing between the data science aspect of what we do and the traditional econometric aspect. And then I discuss other things, right? So synthetic data creation, right? So after you're done with history, because again, in finance, and we were discussing this earlier before the call, finance is relatively data poor compared to natural science, right? And somebody said, "What are you talking about? We have so much data." Well, we actually don't. If you think about, again, going back to the drug trial analogy, when you're developing pharmaceuticals, you've noticed that at the very least, you have dozens of folks that are in drug trials, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, right? And each of those people is an individual history. But with us, we only have one history of the S&P 500, and you can't substitute that with, let's say, the Russell 2000 history or Wilshire 5000. It's different, right? So in relevant ways. So we are data poor. So after you're done exploiting, let's say, a single time series, you have to really rely on synthetic data creation, right? In various ways. And I discuss a number of ways of doing that in one of the chapters. Then I think what you have to do is then think about, again, this is like proceeding in chronological order. When I say then, I mean, another element of what you have to think about is appropriate benchmarking and risk and return metrics. And the way that you use benchmarks is a little bit different, not totally different, but a little bit different than you use it. For example, when you're actually running a strategy and you have a benchmark that you're evaluated against. But so benchmark selection it plays a different role, but a unique and important role. Model validation, and then there are a whole other set of statistics that you have to look at that are really focused on really trying to evaluate the predictive ability of your model, and this is especially important for active managers. And I think there's a whole list of these things, and then finally you end with sort of investment theory, trying to reconcile your model at least with the basics of economic and market intuition. if you go through that entire set of procedures, and there's a lot of flexibility and room to navigate among those pillars, I would say, then I think you've done a good, thorough job of validating your model, and it's perhaps ready to go to the next stage of development. But I think what I've seen often, unfortunately, is what I'd say incomplete model development. So there, yes, some of the elements are that I describe are utilized, but not all of them, and not to the extent that they need to be. And that's really the one of the major messages that the monograph is trying to drive home, is that if we want to do justice to our label as a sort of scientific quantitative discipline, and we also want to at least approach the rigor that other product development efforts like drug development and others, let's say automobile development, have, then we have to at least try to implement this type of a framework in all of our products that we try to develop.
Yeah. Well, that's a great tour de force throughout the piece that you've written to us. So maybe we can take a step back then, and you mentioned in the beginning the back testing versus the cross validation, with cross validation really being the subset of back testing. So maybe we'll just start on the back testing too, because I thought it's really interesting how you get into some aspect of back testing that people may not be familiar with, or like think about how you actually do this appropriately. First of all, when and what conditions would you say that backtesting? What cases are backtesting actually useful as opposed to when it's not?
Well, I think it's useful always to an extent, because you have to start somewhere. You have to say, okay, let's take a look at what happened during this time stretch. But I think that first of all, there are important elements to that too. So remember, I mentioned that we're data poor in finance, and so the first inclination of any practitioner is going to try to use as large a sample size as possible when they're doing even an initial back test, right? But that's not always advisable, because unlike data that we find in the natural world, the economies and markets are always changing, right? And evolving much more rapidly than, let's say biological evolution, which occurs over millions and millions of years. So what that means is that if we took a time series, let's say S&P 500 back to 1930, I don't think most people realize that even though the automobile was making great strides by the 30s, horse and buggies were still being used. So you have to ask yourself, when you're modeling things, how relevant is the data that was produced during that time to our product and strategy development today, right? And so, even before the back test is even run, there's a lot of thought that has to go into sample selection, right? So, how far back are we going to go, given the fact that we need data, but we realize that if we go back too much, that data may be less relevant, at least for equities, right? Let's say for commodities, you may, with a straight face, go back that long because oil doesn't change. Although, again, the supply and demand drivers of oil have changed, right? So I'm not trying to say that it's easy street for certain asset classes and it's very challenging for others. There are things to think about no matter what you're modeling. But in general, at least with equities, you have to really think about these technological changes that have occurred. Now, the other thing that is important, and you mentioned cross-validation, is that a lot of the data science techniques, most of them actually, were not developed by us, right, by financial investment practitioners. They were developed by computer scientists or with natural science applications in mind. And so when you're actually applying something like cross-validation, you are even time series cross-validation, you're presented with the challenge of picking the subsamples, the folds, as they're called, to select. And there isn't really a clear way of doing that. And so what I advocate, and I've written about this, I have a whole framework called modular machine learning, which I published about in the Journal of Financial Data Science, is where you use a traditional regime switching model, which have, by the way, a historically poor track record of predicting, right? They're not good at forecasting, but they are a very economically and statistically sound way of cutting up the world, right? Dividing subsamples into economically meaningful folds, as they were. And so what I advocate in the monograph and other places is to actually use regime switching to actually figure out how many and how large and when, and the sort of the makeup of the different folds that you use in cross-validation. So what I'm getting at is that even though backtesting on the surface, whether it's traditional backtesting or cross-validation, may seem like a basic thing, and mathematically, yes, it's basic, but there are many contours that you have to think through as a practitioner in order to actually inject the requisite level of realism, of acceptability, I call straight-facedness, right, into the study. Because what you don't want to end up with is something that, yes, maybe on paper, kind of passes a statistical smell test or two or three, but when you actually subject it to further scrutiny, especially economic and market scrutiny, intuition, it sort of falls on its face. So that's kind of, I think, the important things to think about, even before you get into doing the back test, is really sort of how far you go back, how you cut up the different subsamples. And then when you're doing a back test, a single back test is obviously not enough. You have to have different inception points that you look at. You have to look at implementation issues. In other words, you have to do away with the mythology of instantaneous trading, right? You have to consider transaction costs. There's a whole slew of things that I'll talk about in the monograph that back testing can be useful for, because you may think, oh, look, this makes sense conceptually and investment theory wise. That's good. Mathematically, this makes sense. Now we're running it. It looks good. Oh, but wait a minute. We didn't account for transaction costs. We're doing instantaneous trading. Our firm has different protocols on how you can trade, when you can trade, that are actually going to, if you incorporate those considerations, will erode the alpha, let's say, that you're producing with the model. So backtesting in itself, although it has its limits, can actually help in the early stages of validation in filtering out infeasible strategies, right? So that's when I think backtesting is the most useful. Now, when is it not useful? It's when you end there, right? And you don't do anything further, because what is the biggest risk, in backtesting? It's that you produce an overfitted model. So a model that is so, let's say, attuned to the sample that you are modeling, that when you present new data to it, it doesn't what they call generalize to that new data, okay? And that is the biggest risk. And that's why it's important to not only do a basic backtest over one horizon, but do cross-validation, do it on different kind of economically meaningful folds, different inception points, all of this, because again, active managers are professional forecasters, but also at least amateur statisticians, hopefully professional statisticians. And for us, it's very important that this overfitting problem be addressed. And this is one of the biggest pitfalls, if not the biggest, in model development, is that you want to make sure at all times that you are not overfitting the model, right? Because while it's nice to explain the past, our job is to predict the future. And so you want to have a model and a product and a strategy that actually generalizes successfully to new data, not just explains the old data.
Yeah, overfitting, certainly a big topic in any area where you have data and people try to create the perfect model, so to speak. No, that's really helpful about where backtesting can go wrong, and the warnings around that. So the cross validation, then, like you touched on it, but this is applying data in a little bit different manner. Maybe you can just give a overview and understanding of when this is useful.
Well, again, we're in a constant battle against what I call essentially cheating, right? And this may be inadvertent cheating too, right? Because look, we've all lived through history, so we all have experiences that are embedded in our minds. And when we're developing a model, we are trying, even the most honest practitioner. I have no doubt that most investment professionals are honest and truthful and so on, honorable folks. There are different biases that may creep in, different cheats, if you want to call them that may creep in. And I think the purpose of cross-validation, in essence, is to, at least on the data side, to prevent some of that cheating. And the way you do that is that you reserve, in its simplest form, one subsample to develop your model. And then, without that model, in essence, seeing the other two sets of data, you use another subsample to refine the model. And then finally, the last unseen subsample to test it in its entirety. And then if it doesn't work, then you go back to square one and you try to do it all over. Back to the drawing board, in essence. So that's really it really regiments, I would say, the back testing process. Now there are other bells and whistles, different kinds of cross validation and so on, but in essence, that's what it's doing.
So when we're looking at validating models now, and we want to assess their usefulness, you talk about performance, kind of the performance analysis, so to speak, of how you measure performance of models. Maybe you can start by just giving an overview of how to think about, even start thinking about what we mean about performance and how to see it.
Well, I go through the whole litany of return metrics and risk metrics, and they're all useful. But I want to remind folks that there are things beyond standard deviation, Sharpe ratios, and even information ratios. Right, there are a lot of other metrics that you could use, and it doesn't mean that you have to use list X and then you're done. What the sort of the performance metric part of the monograph really is trying to say, look, keep in mind that you want to have a holistic and very thorough, multidimensional approach to risk and return measurement when you're validating your model and your strategy, and just keep that in mind. I think the more important aspect of that chapter is really the benchmarking chapter. Not because folks don't know what benchmarking is, but I think the one takeaway there is that benchmarking some types of asset classes is a little bit more challenging than others. For example, fixed income. Because whenever there's you have issues with maturity, you have prepayments, you have new issues. All of this has to be taken into account because when different things happen in the market, in the fixed income market, the benchmarks will change in relevant ways, and that may impact your strategy in different ways as well, or what you have to do to make your strategy remain consistent with the benchmark that you're using. But I think the most important takeaway is that unlike, let's say, a live PM who has a benchmark that they're measured against, let's say for their bonus or by the clients or a sort of the consultants and so on, when you are using benchmarks to model validate, you actually may want to use more than one. One beyond the one that will be sort of the official benchmark once a product goes live. For example, I advocate using an equal weighted portfolio for a number of reasons, right? It is an additional benchmark. An equal weighted portfolio is really the no information portfolio, right? It's if you had no views on anything, that's what you use. And at least in equity space, it's usually a very difficult benchmark to beat. So for if you versus let's say an active trading strategy. So that's one point. And then you may want to use other benchmarks. So for example, an absolute return type of benchmark. Okay, we beat the benchmark and we beat equal weight, but did we achieve, let's say on an annual basis, return above X%, right? And I think again, all of this is the falsification effort, right? It's trying to break the model, and by model I'm interchanging model with strategy, right? Trying to break the strategy, and if we can't do it or we have a hard time doing it, then we have a good chance that this could be something that we could develop into a commercially successful product that will help, our end users, right? And that's the whole idea there. So, what I want folks to do is be as thorough as possible. So I'll give you an example. Whenever I developed a strategy, I call it, in the monograph, I call it reputation risk, but I really call it humiliation risk, so internally. And this goes when I'm writing a research article or I'm building an investment strategy. Is there anything that I haven't accounted for? And I'm a human being, right? I mean, there's limits to everybody. But is there anything that is glaringly missing from what I've done where it may later come and bite me? And that's kind of what I'm advocating. I actually have a working philosophy of model validation that I take from chess, right? So in chess, there's a concept called prophylaxis. And the idea of prophylaxis is that any move that you make in a chess match should not only to serve your advancement in the game, but also should serve to thwart your opponent's advancement, right? So what you have to do if you take a prophylactic approach to chess is you actually have to try to think moves ahead. If I do this and my opponent does this, and then I did this, and then my opponent did this, what would happen? And that's why, the best chess players, they have this ability. And I give some historical references of world champions and so on that utilize this. But that's really what I'm trying to do when I'm actually building a model at all times, is take a prophylactic approach, right? What if I did this move, if I built this, if we do this move, if somebody that I respect read this or knew about this, what would they say? How would they try to thwart this? And I don't know how much experience you have with quants, but quants are ruthless. I'm a little bit older now, but whenever you present a model in front of a bunch of quants, it'll be like, hyenas at a kill, right? They'll just jump on you and look for any weakness. And this is a lesson I learned when I was, a youth, right? Let's say, and I've kept that sort of paranoia, if you will, as I've gotten older, where anytime I build any kind of a strategy or a model, I'm thinking to myself, what will the naysayers or the folks that will, let's say, look under the hood, what will they try to find wrong with it, and can I account for that attack, if you will? So that's really the approach I advocate for everybody. I don't see it as much as I'd like to see it, but I think it's readily implementable or applicable by a lot of folks on the street who just haven't sort of been enlightened to the fact that they have to do this, right? Because it's not so much about technical prowess as more conceptual clarity, right? And once you understand that these are the things that you have to do to actually present something with a straight face, then I think more people will be better off.
Yeah, those are two interesting, like, different approaches. I think that the equivalent of in economics would be what we call the impartial spectator, for anyone who's ever read Adam Smith. But when we talk about, like, the benchmarking, this is really, we're talking about the results of a model. That is, I apply this model, I'm going to do some kind of trading strategy in accordance to a model that I have, and now look at the result. And in one way of doing that, as mentioned, is like the back testing. Like, if the market did this and I would have traded this according to my model, how would it work? And then you compare it to some benchmark historically. So you can do that historically, right? And then, as you point out too, you can do it through simulations. That's kind of a different approach of getting there, right? It's kind of creating this alternative universe. And you got into a little bit of that, so we can talk a little bit of that. I think in terms of, I think anyone with a CFA may remember Monte Carlo simulations, and there are others that you mentioned as well. But maybe yeah, the bootstrapping one I think was interesting. Like, even though it's shouldn't be that unfamiliar, I think a lot of people might not be familiar, even though if they are Monte Carlo. So maybe you can start with just kind of comparing those two and pointing out when they're which one is applicable and the strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, this is a big part of my process where, I don't use Monte Carlo simulation as much anymore. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with it. I think the more simpler approaches to Monte Carlo, I go into sort of their drawbacks. You have non-parametric Monte Carlo, but in general you assume some sort of distribution, you posit some inputs, and then you basically essentially generate synthetic data. Utilizing a pseudo-random number generator and so on. And there are much more sophisticated approach to Monte Carlo simulation. I don't want to put it down. I give you a sort of an technical example in the paper. But then I think one of the drawbacks has often been, especially with the more basic kinds of Monte Carlo, has been the fact that they don't account for sort of the empirical shape of the distribution that we see in asset returns. And so I think over the years, and you're right, bootstrapping was invented in 1979, right? Efron introduced it, I believe. That's what I cite the paper. And I have used it for decades, but I think that is not as utilized as it should be. And essentially what bootstrapping is you take your original sample or a subsample, and then you resample it, and then you sort of you put it together in different. So I give an analogy, or I give in the monograph. So if you want to understand what bootstrapping is, I recall a famous episode of Star Trek called Bread and Circuses, and in this episode, the Enterprise lands on a planet that resembles Earth in every way, except that the Roman Empire never fell, and so it's the Roman Empire, but it has 20th century technology and so on and so forth. And they go through an adventure and so on. And the point is that bootstrapping is similar to this in that it's what I call historical combinatorics. Right? You're taking actual history and then you're recombining it in different ways to create a new history. And the nice part about that is that you will retain a lot of the behaviors, especially if you use blocks of samples, not just individual observations. You'll retain a lot of behaviors like mean reversion, momentum, etc., all the dependencies, chronological dependencies that you encounter by utilizing empirical distribution and then resampling. So one of the things I've done over the years is not only done cross-validation with actual historical data, but then generated, let's say, hundreds of bootstraps of time series synthetic time series, and then run cross-validation on those synthetic time series as well. And so again, this is an effort to say, look, was the success of our initial strategy in a historical backtest, was that due to, let's say, a few lucky trades, or just maybe the way that the patterns fell out in real history, right? How overfitted essentially was our model, even though we've done all the checks and all the, we've accounted for, let's say, strong overfitting, we've mitigated against it. What if we throw a completely new set of historical contours at the model? What will it do? And so I found the bootstrapping, especially we often use what's called stationary bootstrap. It's Romano and Politis. They had a paper in 93. I use that quite a bit. And then I essentially subject those historical bootstraps to cross-validation. Now, beyond that, I also mentioned generative adversarial networks. It's a machine learning approach to synthetic data creation. And it was really, has often been used in image reproduction, but I describe in the monograph how you can actually use it to create synthetic time series. And then, you can actually go another level. So I went beyond that. I say, well, you can actually do the following. Your inputs to the GAN, as they're called, the network, doesn't have to be the actual S&P 500. You can be, right? And you can generate synthetic time series off of that. But you can actually bootstrap the S&P 500 and then throw the bootstraps in as inputs to the GAN and create another level of synthetic time series, right? So it never ends is the point. But the point is that, you have to at least go a little bit towards this direction of getting all of these new histories to test your strategies on, however you do it. Because if you don't, then you're just, you're running the risk of, again, even though you haven't technically overfitted your model, you're running the risk of not accounting for something that may happen in the future or in a different way, and the fact that your model and strategy may not be able to account for and deal with it successfully. So that's really and that's an important chapter, and it's something I emphasize. Like, I don't see as much as I'd like to see actually on the street, but it's something that I advocate very strongly.
I imagine that this is a time when most people and a lot of people can understand the intuition between like a bootstrapping technology that asks, like, this is your history, what might be the next iteration? Because that is exactly what an AI does when we're doing a chat GPT, right? That it basically tries to predict what will be the logical following, words or answer to this question, kind of by knowing the history. What are the possible different outcomes? And you ask it again, you'll have different answers.
But there's one important difference, right? Keep in mind that if you're talking about language, right, grammar has a set of rules, and even though you may innovate on grammar with slang and idiomatic speech and so on, in general, the logical choices, although very vast, for most folks and most language algorithms, will give you maybe a similar set of predictions as to what comes next, given that the algorithm or the person knows language. I think with finance or the markets, there are that's why we have things like we call black swans or tail events. I think what you have to account for in the model validation process is the potentially unforeseen events. So let's just call them the gray swans, right? That's just a Bill Gross term, right? So the things that you don't know in entirety if they're going to happen or what they would look like, but they may happen. And I think the validation process has to try to account for those, at least those gray swans, as much as possible, which is a little bit different than the language example where there is a logical place to go. I think we have to try to see if our strategies can cope with the illogical occurrences, right? Like we often see in the markets, right? Remember the Keynes dictum that, the markets can stay rational more than you can stay solvent. It's that idea. How well can your strategy deal with this irrationalities that often pop up in the markets? And you have to try to account for those things.
So that touches actually a little bit on the stress testing and the scenario analysis. You talk about that too. I think that's what a lot of people think about when you discuss what could possibly happen. Maybe we can just give it an overview of how you would describe what stress testing is. Start there.
Yeah, so some of our viewers will most of our viewers will be familiar with at least the basics of stress testing. It's the idea that you have a portfolio of assets, and you want to sort of shock them in some way to figure out what the likely losses will be in a certain type of market event. Now, stress testing is important again in the context of financial product development because any kind of physical product, think about a bridge or a car or anything else, like you see all the crash test videos, right? They will be subjected to stress testing as well. And so financial products really need to be subjected to these kinds of shocks as well. Now, the framework I present in the monograph is based on the fact that, or the acceptance or the assumption that most practitioners, especially quantitative practitioners, in some way use some sort of a factor framework. And I'm not saying any specific factor framework, but just factors meaning, a restricted set of drivers of your portfolio, right? Um, and the whole idea of stress testing then becomes how to shock those factors, how to stress them, how to pull them in different ways to then understand how the shocks to those factors or different sort of recalibrations, if you will, of those factor values will impact their portfolio values, and try to quantify the loss. Mm-hmm. So, I present a framework, or I give some ideas of how to select factors in a clean, nice way. I talk about something called Lasso, which the data scientists in the audience will be familiar with. One of the nice things about Lasso, I will just say on the side, sort of outside the box a little bit, is that because it proceeds from a regression type of a framework, it's a nice place to begin in feature selection because it can help you with simpler models like OLS regressions, but then you can also dump those features into more sophisticated machine learning algorithms and use them there as well. So there's a nice continuity that you get between sort of the traditional statistics and the newer technologies or algorithms by using a lasso-like framework to select factors. Of course, there are many others, and I'm not sort of necessarily partial to lasso per se, but it has that practical aspect that it actually speaks to a traditional quantitative analysis, but then also can lend itself to sort of newer approaches as well. So I think that's essentially the stress testing chapter. I talk about scenario analysis as well, a little bit, how the scenarios don't have to necessarily be taken from history, but they can be. I talk about the fact that they can also be based on ex ante events or sort of expected events. I give the example of the fiscal cliff that we had a number of years ago, where folks were trying to sort of quantify what the likely impact of the fiscal cliff would be on various types of assets. So I think stress testing and scenario analysis, I think, is something that a lot of folks do. I think, though, my recommendation would be to make sure that you have a formalized process of how you implement stress testing so that it's very cleanly done, if you will, and transparent to all the stakeholders that are involved.
Yeah, you do touch also on the scenario analysis, like that has a few pitfalls on its own. So maybe you want to touch on that too, would be helpful.
I mean, there's a couple, right? So when you're trying to do scenario analysis on a scenario that hasn't happened but that you are imagining, then it becomes hard or more challenging, I say, not hard, but challenging to figure out, well, what are now the quantitative inputs into the scenario that we have not ever encountered before, right? And so that's not a very that's fairly obvious, I think, to some. And then even when you have the data readily available for a given scenario, you obviously don't know if that scenario is going to reproduce itself exactly the same way in the future. Even though we've had certain instances of, let's say, inflation shock, right? You can go in the late 70s, you can go to different periods of time where you had inflation shocks. And those are useful guides to a certain extent until they're not useful anymore. So again, these are things to think about. I think we're human. There's limitations to what we can do. We have, tools now that can help us maybe think about these things more. But I think, as long as we're thorough about it, I think that's the main goal, right? It's not to leave any stone unturned. That said, even if we turn over a stone, we may not find something very useful, or we may not account for something. But, the most that we can do as professionals is really try to be as thorough as possible. And that's really the emphasis of the stress testing chapter.
Yeah, that makes sense. So on the stress testing too, you mentioned reverse stress testing, which also might be something that people have not heard about who's watching here. So maybe you can.
Yeah, I was just a little bit on that. That's just the flip side of stress testing, where you essentially say, look, okay, we will lose X number of clients, if our performance is X. And then now let's go and figure out what type of scenarios would actually could generate that bad performance,
Mhm.
right? And so it's just another way of thinking about the problem, but fundamentally not different in its goal from stress testing in its basic form.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So as we're approaching a little bit the end here, I want to have a few questions about just more the high level. You talk about the validating model against theory. So this is a perennial issue in any science. Probably you have a theory, you have data. Do the data always need to confirm to the theory, or the other way around? And you kind of make the argument that you want to validate a model not only against everything we talked about so far, but also against kind of economic theory, or probably like finance theory, as I would think of it. So what are the theoretical tenets that you would say could never be breached if the data do not seem to validate this or follow in a specific theory? There's something wrong, because basically in economics I only know one, which is demand curve slope down. Otherwise, there really is none that I can think of. You don't find people who would say, look, it still had to be proven, and there are different ways of looking at this. So how would you see this in this very context where we're at?
Now, my approach is a little bit different. I kind of hint at it in the monograph. Well, I say it explicitly that we cannot expect to have any given model conform perfectly to any one or more theories out there. But what I think has to be done is to think about, do the assumptions of the model at least correspond to some sort of framework that has been accepted or has some evidence that speaks in favor of it. So I'm not saying don't be don't be a proponent of efficient market hypothesis. I'm not saying don't be be or don't be a proponent of behavioral finance. What I'm saying is, whenever you build any given model, it has to be conceptually consistent with some sort of basic economic or market intuition. And I go through a lot of the theories in fair amount of detail. What do I mean by that in terms of, and I already mentioned it in terms of behavioral finance, right? In terms of, okay, if you believe in biases and heuristics and the pitfalls that may occur to investors and market participants because of those behavioral characteristics, then is your model trying to capitalize on that? What evidence is there that your model actually detects those anomalies or those behaviors, and so on? And that's all I'm asking for. But I want to stress, I don't talk about this at length because it's not
Right.
really part of the monograph, but I think it's very dangerous to have our predictive models, let's call it for active managers, be slaves, if you will, to theory. Because we tried that once in econometrics, right? So in the early 20th century, when the foundations of econometrics were being laid, right? The Cowles Commission, which was at Yale, and Tallinn Koopman, he's a famous econometrician, he was leading that charge, and Havelmo and some of his colleagues, they really advocated this idea that the empirical side is much less important than the theory side. So even when you're building statistical models in econometrics, the goal is to find, essentially, you're trying to puncture economic reality, if you will, quote unquote.
Mhm.
And they were deliberately going after the National Bureau of Economic Research, which was here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near where I am. And the Ember folks were much more empirically oriented. And ultimately, the theoreticians, if you will, won and laid the foundation for econometrics. Now, if you look back, which in turn had an impact on finance, because financial econometrics essentially took its cue from econometrics, core econometrics. And if you look at the predictive or empirical, the forecasting history of many well-known econometric models, while they're not a complete failure, they're not really as successful as they should be, let's say, for use in a professional investment context. And this is, I think, why eventually an opening was presented for data science or financial data science, because data science and machine learning are really concerned with a pattern recognition, but also prediction, right? So they are less theoretical often. They're not as good at explaining what happened, but they're much stronger at predicting. And so I think I'm much more of an instrumentalist, if you will, when it regards to models. I'm not looking for any model to tell me what economic or financial reality is, right?
Hmm.
What I'm looking for is for the model to predict successfully and reliably. That said, if I have no look through into the model, so it's completely opaque, number one. Number two, if the model, I have whatever transparency or look through I have into it, tells me things about the markets and and economics that are really inconsistent with just basic tenets of human behavior, self-interest, market drivers, and so on, then that's also a red flag. So that's all I'm at, but that's all I'm asking for. As long as you have a sort of a minimally consistent model, what I mean minimally consistent with economic theory, then you move to the next stage where the burden, and so all the evaluation, the assessment goes on this predictive effectiveness. And that's just not me talking, right? So if you want to go through, in the history of economics, even though sort of the Cowles Commission School One, even as late as the 40s, right? Milton Friedman was really advocating for an instrumentalist approach to economic models. And he really viewed models as really just ways of organizing data and making predictions. And a more recent paper, recent meaning I think 90s, was written. Larry Summers even advocated an approach like this, basically saying in the paper that he wrote, I think it was the Scandinavian Journal of Economics, I think it was in '98 he wrote this paper. He basically said, let's admit that econometric models are not as successful at forecasting as we'd like them to be, and here are the reasons. They had to send his own approach towards it. So I'm not alone in this, but I'm a strong advocate of an instrumentalist approach to models. They have to conform to the basics of economic and market theory, but they don't have to be, sort of aligned with it 100%. That's not really where I'm going with this, mainly because we are practitioners. We're trying to create successful products that can help our clients. And, we can't, essentially expend the time and resources making sure the models are theoretically sound in every single detail. But as long as we understand the basic drivers of the models, then the results are what counts.
Yeah, I always get really scared when people say, let the data speak for itself. And somehow there's kind of a theory that pops out of the data analysis somewhere, just more to conforming to the data than the other way around. So this has been a great conversation. Just to wrap up here, I'd like to hear from you. I feel like our listeners would have and viewers would have learned a tremendous amount. I certainly did talking to you. Anything that you would want to add that you hope that our readers of your piece, because we're obviously going to link to the piece and make sure that people read it. What should they take away from it and from this conversation? And maybe if you want to set it in the context of your own broader research as well.
Yeah, I would say my main piece of advice is be thorough in the process. And if you want one buzzword to take away, it would be falsification. Don't be afraid to try to break the models. It's okay. If they break, you just go back and you start over. And in the end, your clients and your firms look better off for a more robust and thoroughly validated model versus one that you just took because it was the first successful one. So falsification really should be the going theme for quantitative finance as we go forward. It's extremely important, especially if we want to really inject sort of a scientific air of rigor into our practices.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the Financial Thought Exchange podcast. I've been your host, Lotta Moberg. Our guest has been Joseph Simonian, and we will see you again soon.
For more information, please visit rpc.cfainstitute.org/research-foundation.